Hi, my name is Sameer Khedekar, founder and managing attorney at Banyan Law, the immigration law firm for the high-tech field. So in our last video, we talked about how founders can get H-1Bs. Now, the catch is you have to get an H-1B in the first place, and that means you have to get to the lottery. What if you cannot get an H-1B in the lottery? What are your options as a founder? So we'll talk about that today. And the first option is, well, remember that there are actually H-1B options that don't require you to be in the lottery. These are typically reserved for employees at universities or employees at nonprofit research organizations. Those are the two most common lottery-exempt H-1Bs. But if you're a founder of a for-profit startup, can you take advantage of those two? And the answer is you actually can in a couple of ways. Number one, if your startup has a very strong connection or nexus to one of those two organizations, a nonprofit research organization or a university, then you can get an H-1B that's lottery exempt as long as you can show that your work is primarily geared towards the purposes and the kind of the mission of that relationship with those two entities. So that's one way to do it. The other way to do it is there are programs out there, and we'd be happy to talk to you about that can sponsor you for H-1Bs with universities. Then you can get and those are part-time H-1Bs, so they're lottery exempt. And once you have a lottery exempt H-1B, you as a founder can get another kind of a concurrent or kind of H-1B that runs on the side of that first one, and you can get that for your startup. So once again, you have an H-1B with the university, for example. You work 5-10 hours a week for that institution, and then you have a concurrent H-1B for your startup. Once again, there are programs that we know of that have actually work very well that can help you through those processes. So consider those. Let's go back to the individuals who typically need the H-1B lottery, and these are students on OPTs, right? So you've graduated, you're on your first year OPT, or you might be in your second or third year STEM OPT. You can work on your own company in all three of those situations. Well, let's say two of those situations, right? All three of those years. The first year, it doesn't really take much. There's no really kind of requirement or prohibition against starting your own company and working on it, and even not paying yourself, on the first year OPT. With the STEM OPT, there are a couple of more complications, but you can still do it. Number one, your company needs to be e-verified. So you have to set up your company with the e-verify program. That's the program created by the government to enforce work enforcement rules. And secondly, you have to make sure that there's an employer-employee relationship like we talked about in the last video. So you have a co-founder or board or some entity that can kind of on paper oversee the work that you do. If you're able to do that, then you can certainly work on your startup in the OPT phase while you're trying to figure out what your next step is going to be. After the OPT, you want to think about, okay, what am I going to transition to? Well, there's the L1 visa. We'll do a full separate video on that because it'll take a long time to kind of discuss. But suffice to say that if you can show that, let's say you have a PhD, or maybe you don't have a PhD, but you've done some good research that's really kind of been noticed by people in your field. Maybe you've won awards. Maybe you've worked for companies kind of in a leading or critical role. Maybe you've served as judges at the kind of hackathons or kind of startup pitch competitions or some other competitions, right? If these things apply to you, there is a possibility that you can get the L1 visa, which is the visa for extraordinary ability. Also consider if you're one of, a national from one of a few countries, there are trade agreements, right, between the US and those countries that actually allow you to get visas that are very similar to the H-1B, and there's no quote. Those countries are Canada, Mexico, Australia, Singapore, and Chile. If you're from one of those countries, you can easily get a visa to perform your work as a founder in the US. There is a visa called the E2 visa, which is, in theory, a really good visa for company owners, right? It's an investor visa. Now, first of all, the main requirement is that you be a citizen of a country that has a treaty, an E2 treaty with the US. Right off the bat, India and China do not have an E2 treaty. So if you're an Indian or Chinese national, you cannot get an E2 visa. But if you're from one of 78 other countries, and there's a list, you can Google it, then you can possibly get it. How do you do it? How do you get an E2 visa? Number one, you have to show that you're investing a substantial amount of money and you've already spent that money into your business in the US. What is substantial? There really isn't a number provided by the government. It's really relative to the kind of business you're running. We generally see that any amount spent over $100,000 generally gets approved. but obviously not guaranteed. Number two, you have to show that the origin of the money, it's either yours, right? Or it's from other people, but who are from the same country as you. The money has to have the origin in the treaty country. And the government is very clear that you have to be able to trace the origin of the money. So if you can do those things, there's a really good chance that you can get an E2 visa. And we'd be happy to talk to you about the process. It's a super kind of unique process to get visas, unlike the H-1B or other kind of common visas, but you can definitely look into it. Finally, if you happen to be running your company abroad, and you've probably Googled this and you've probably already seen this, and you want to move to the US, then you can look at the L1 new office visa. Very similar to the E2, but there's no country restriction. It can be from any country so long as you've been working on and running your company for at least a year in the past 3 years. If your idea is to come and move it here, you have to show many of the same things that you show in the E2 context about your investment and your potential for growth and your hiring plans. There isn't a minimum number of people you have to hire, but you want to show that you're going to grow and hire US workers. That's essentially what the government's looking for. If you're able to show all that, then you are a candidate for the L1 new office. But caveat, the L1 is a very, very hard visa to get approved. And given the choice between an L1 and an E2, we almost always go with the E2 because they're a lot easier than the L1, which has really become a focus of scrutiny on the government's part. And then finally, there's like the most unclear option right now, just because we haven't seen any cases approved, but it is live. If you cannot get a visa of any sort, but you really, really need something to be here and work here in the US, consider the IEP, or the International Entrepreneur Parole. It's basically a temporary permission to be here. It's not a visa, but it's like a permission to be here and work in the US on your startup, given that your startup meets certain conditions. Like it's received just over a couple $100,000 in funding. There are other kind of exceptions to that. But you want to be able to show that if you have a qualifying startup, then you can apply for this IEP benefit. Now, the only problem is that we have no idea how long the applications are taking. They seem to be taking at least 6-8 months. I don't think we've seen any approved from the ones that were initially filed about 6 or 8 months ago as of this date, which is September of 2022. So it's really unclear, and it's kind of a shot in the dark, but it's a legitimate option. And as time progresses, we'll probably get kind of clearer guidance on the process that the government uses to adjudicate these. So hopefully this is helpful. Options that are not H-1B, lottery exempt related for founders, how to get work permission here in the US.